Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Rana and Jasmine, for today's welcoming remarks. I have the pleasure of introducing our lovely speakers. So firstly, Dr. Joaquin Muñoz, pronouns he, him, his, grew up on the Pascua Yaqui Indian Reservation in Arizona, where he learned early on about the complicated issues of race, culture, history, and oppression. He obtained his PhD from the University of Arizona and is currently an assistant professor of Indigenous education at the University of British Columbia. His research focuses on Indigenous education and teacher education, with a focus on supporting teachers to be effective when working with diverse Indigenous populations through cultural awareness, critical pedagogy practices, and culturally responsive pedagogy. Dr. Muñoz has spent the past decade developing skills for this work by using methods that include Indigenous circle work, the theater of the oppressed, various forms of art, dialogue, and literacy tools. His favorite Indigenous young adult literature book of all times is The Marrow Thieves. Next, Dr. Edie Farrell, she, her, is Anishinaabe and a status member of the Admitung First Nation. She has maternal ancestral ties with the Slipperjack family of Whitewater Lake First Nation and is of the Sturgeon clan. Her father is of Scottish, Highland and Lowland, Irish, County Cork, and English, Stratford-upon-Avon descent, and a second-generation settler. She grew up with two sisters and two gifted storytelling parents in Thunder Bay, Ontario, the land of the sleeping giant. Its protector, Mishu Pishu, the water panther spirit, and Miki Waju, Thunderbird Mountain. Dr. Farrell is fascinated by the ways in which story inspires us to engage with emotion, imagination, and spirit in our everyday lives. As such, she aims to engage with story, storying, and storytelling through her research, writing, and teaching. Dr. Farrell's research interests include the exploration of Indigenous sacred story teachings and storytelling methods into creative narrative works, her innovative Indigenous storying methodology, the articulated role and lives of First Nations women during the fur trade period in Canada, the interconnections of Indigenous knowledge, culture, traditions, and sacred story between and within conceptions of science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, coming-of-age stories of Anishinaabe young women, and the practical application of Indigenous knowledge, spirituality, and culture into mainstream curricula and teaching practices. Both these speakers clearly do amazing, amazing work, so please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Sego Sewigwego, Jennifer Yanyats Gutnig Huganii, Tandanega Nigawegeno. So hello and welcome. I'm so delighted to be here with two wonderful colleagues. And I guess I'll start just by prefacing that one of the things that brings us together, I think, is that we're all Indigenous literature scholars that are actually situated within faculties of education, specifically curriculum teaching and learning. And it's interesting because there's a synergy, I think, across the work that we do. And I'm hoping that that will come through in our conversation tonight. So with that, while our work is situated within Indigenous literatures, and aligns closely with our colleagues in Indigenous Studies or English Studies, and we all met at the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, I'm really excited about the things that bring us together, our shared research interests, and I'm going to get the conversation started on that note. So I'm excited about the kind of projects that we're already starting to dream up together, so stay tuned. For myself, I lean into Indigenous onto-epistemologies that showcase our knowledges, that our knowledges are inherently interdisciplinary. So for a long time, I kind of felt lost in the Faculty of Education. I wondered how I landed in a Faculty of Education as someone who teaches Indigenous literatures and thought that I might better be situated in women and gender studies departments. But I think that that's true of many Indigenous scholars, right? That our work is just interdisciplinary. And so I've felt like while this feeling has shifted from this kind of idea that I'm an outlier in a faculty of education, not really sure where I should be situated, to then knowing that my home place in academia aligns with the notion of the strength of our work being interdisciplinary and finding like-minded colleagues. So I wonder, to get started, if each of you could comment on your journey into curriculum teaching and learning as an Indigenous Literatures scholar, if that's what we're referring to ourselves as. Me, without a background in English or Indigenous studies, but an Indigenous person that landed in education somehow. I wonder if you two had similar feelings of being oddly situated in academia, as if that's not already a reality for Indigenous scholars.
So my mother's Ruby Slipperjack, so she's already a published author. Her first book came out when I was under 10 years old, and I remember her opening up the box of all her books. And she had it as a surprise for my sisters and I. And that was the beginning, I think, of me seeing Indigenous authors, right? Like, quite literally my mother. And I think just from there, I always had this inspiration of not just, loving story, but wanting to tell my own. And I did an undergrad in English, honors English, with a background of a secondary in history. But all of my other education from there was in education. And so for my master's, I knew what I wanted to do for my PhD when I was in my master's. And so, but I knew I needed a grounding before I did the work in my PhD. So I did some work around Indigenous epistemologies and ways of knowing, and how do I come to understand how I come to know things. So for me, I think it naturally seemed to work in terms of coming into curriculum teaching and learning. For me, it made sense within that teaching field that I wanted to be able to actively participate in an area I love so much and be able to share that with graduate students and future teachers.
I'm so glad that I get to have this conversation with these two folks, because I feel like I don't have to explain everything. But one of the biggest tasks, and I don't know for the folks in here who are graduate students, so much of our work is this sort of trying to piece together these disparate parts of who we are, and trying to make these arguments that the way we think and the way we pull things together belongs in spaces like higher education. And so for a very long time, I emphasized education and was really trying to make myself the best teacher that I could be without thinking about how my love of literature could play a part in being an educator that way. And more so when I came into higher education, where the emphasis on how we prepare teachers to be effective teachers takes on a very particular definition, which never made sense to me, because when I was growing up, when I was going to school, when I do everything that I do, like I live in between spaces. The community that I come from is an in-between space. The way we define our culture is an in-between space. Borders play prominent roles in how we think about who we are. And so I've never been uncomfortable with the ambiguity of interdisciplinarity, because that's my definition, which makes arguments with my department chair really, really difficult, right? Because of course you're interdisciplinary, but what's your discipline? And so being more comfortable and more confident to stand and say, by definition, I am interdisciplinary. By definition, I am beyond the disciplines that you can conceive of. But I can still profess here. And And then I think about my students and I think about the teachers that I'm trying to prepare and how they live in all these in-between spaces. And so it took a while for me to get comfortable to be able to say all of these disparate parts of who I am belong together and belong here in this space. It's still a conversation that is ongoing for me because I occasionally run into folks who still don't agree with me. And all of this connects through the ways that I think about teacher preparation and working with future educators to think about how I want them to stand in their classrooms and how I want them to be in their classrooms. So a little uncomfortable, but I'm getting better at it.
Thank you so much. So, Dr. Farrell, you spoke about your mother, but my next question is about your journey with Indigenous literatures. So, for the both of you, was there a particular author or authors, so in addition to your mom maybe, that moved you and inspired you to begin working with Indigenous YA literatures? And how does their writing shape your work today? So, I guess I'll pass it to you first, and then you guys next.
So other than my mother, I think Eden Robinson's Monkey Beach was probably one that I felt a large spark with. I felt so spiritually connected with so many of the scenes within that novel, especially those with the crows. Those are what stood out to me the most. And this sense, because I love horror, but this sense of eeriness that is evoked in her work, although it's not horror at all. But I think for me, that's what drew me towards that particular book, is the sense of eeriness and unknown. And because in our Faculty of Education, I don't necessarily always get to teach particular texts. I usually leave choice of text to my students. So I'm always excited when somebody chooses that one. But I think that sense of choice for me is really important in my classes, although right now I'm teaching a PVDE course, which is Indigenous STEAM, Science and Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Math. And we're using Mare with Thieves, Sherry Dealin's Mare with Thieves, which is more sci-fi, dystopian, as our book club for the course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. There's too many to name. I guess I would say probably the Marrow Thieves. And all of the work by Sherry Dimline is absolutely just, for those of you who haven't read it, go out and buy and read everything that she's ever done. She's an incredible author. But I found her at a really interesting time in my life. I was a new professor of education at a small university in Minneapolis and was getting somewhat disenchanted with what I was teaching. I was responsible for the one mandatory course that all teacher education students needed to take that we sort of playfully behind the scenes referred to as how to get along with brown people. Most of my students were white European descent and were puzzled by what it meant to work with Black populations, puzzled by what it meant to work with Hmong populations and the Indigenous populations that were very prominent in the Minneapolis area. And so I was teaching this course and just kept running into this roadblock of feeling like I was being ineffective. And a dear friend of mine who's also an Indigenous educator, Odia, called me one day and she said, "Have you read The Marrow Thieves yet?" And it had just come out. It had just been published in the US. And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, you need to go look for it. Go find it, go buy it, and read it." And then, so I went to Louise Erdrich's bookstore in Minneapolis and picked up a copy and started reading it. And then she called me again and she said, "Are you done with it?" And I said, "I just got it today." She said, "When you're done with it, you need to do one thing. You need to call me before you get to the last chapter." And so I kept reading it. This was a Friday afternoon. And I called her Saturday morning because that's when I finished the book. And I said, "Odia, I'm at the last chapter." And she said, "So get ready." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Just get ready." And she hung up the phone. And if you haven't had a chance to read The Marrow Thieves, please go do it. And then before you get to the last chapter, be sure to give me a call so I can walk you through this. And it completely revolutionized the way that I teach all of my courses. Because I'm not housed in an English department, so it's difficult to make the argument that I can use literature as a teaching tool when my job is to prepare teachers for all of the mechanics of curriculum and pedagogy. And so it turned everything that I do on its head, and I do all of my curriculum and pedagogy through Indigenous young adult literature, because I think it speaks to so much to so many prominent areas that our teachers need to be aware of and need to be working on, as Elder Catherine spoke to also.
So interesting. It's interesting that I'm going off script a little bit here, but having that conversation about, so just a little bit of backstory. I said that we had all met through the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, but most of the folks in Indigenous Literary Studies Association are English faculty, or they're in a Department of Indigenous Studies. So we're kind of like the outliers in the Indigenous Literary Studies Association. But it's interesting because we were talking about like the gift of being interdisciplinary, and yet how there's tensions in our own department about, self-defining or just being an interdisciplinary scholar. And yet the Indigenous requirement course, which you were referring to a little bit there, is one course that all teacher candidates take together regardless of the discipline. So it is interdisciplinary, right? Or it's pushing the value of interdisciplinary work. Interesting. But anyways, that wasn't a question. I'm just kind of going off script. But my next question is for Dr. Muñoz. So we had a chance to see you present at the ILSA conference in Winnipeg last year. So the Indigenous Literatures Lab was actually lucky enough to be in the same multi-paper session. And we're really excited about the work that you're doing, as well as the connections to the work that we're doing in the Indigenous Literatures Lab, right? This focus on Indigenous YA literatures. And I know that a lot of your work with Indigenous, what you refer to as CYAL literature, children and young adult literature, also engages the teaching profession, ELA, English Language Arts community. I wonder if you can share a bit about this work and the value of bringing these stories into the classroom. So I guess kind of extending what we've already started to talk about.
Yeah. I think there's an the title of this is about young adult literature and storytelling. And I think there's a really interesting space to play around here, because oftentimes in kind of the imaginary, when we hear the term storytelling, we might sort of evoke like oral storytelling, or we think about maybe grandma or grandpa or uncle telling us a story about a relative or something. Like we have it evokes a particular kind of feeling. One of my favorite authors, who's not a young adult author per se, Joaquin Rice, talks about storytelling that is captured in text. Right? And he lives in kind of this interesting space because he is a storyteller. Part of his process of developing his literature is he tells the story to himself over and over and over again until he could recite it to you orally if you asked him. And then he commits it to paper. But he talks about, right, like I'm an oral storyteller, but I make my money writing books. I'm a journalist, so text is important. And speaking of interdisciplinarity again, he goes on to say, part of what we do is we share these stories, we share this knowledge and this understanding through text, because oftentimes that's the only way folks can get access to them, right? And so when I think about storytelling, when I think about the power that young adult literature carries with it, is it does have this really unique power of communicating these really fundamental truths about life and fundamental understandings about who Indigenous people are and how we are in the world. And there's a little bit of research evidence that seems to suggest that this function happens more effectively through fiction than through nonfiction, which is really interesting, sort of another one of those moments where Indigenous people, we knew what we were doing before scientists figured out what we were doing. That telling a story makes things last longer. That telling story makes knowledge take a deeper and longer lasting root than if I were to spew some facts at you and let you sort of record a chronology of sorts. And I think we have really important information about the power of these stories and the power of these texts, given given the moves towards banning of books in certain places that might remain unnamed, that text, that stories, that books still carry immense power, that books and texts and stories still carry this immense sort of transformative capability. And within literature, we often talk about this notion of the theory of mind, that reading the story or hearing the story or reading a text somehow gives me the ability to understand somebody else that I might not understand, right? From an Indigenous standpoint, this is really interesting because I look for books for myself and I look for books for my students that reflect me. And so there's a lot of very tense interdisciplinary things that are going on here as we talk about story and how it's used and when it's used and why it's used. And so that's why I talk about this a lot. I write about this a lot. A couple of pieces that I wrote last year talk about the use of young adult literature to support teacher candidates, the use of young adult literature to support teacher candidates to support K through 12 students, the use of literature, and not just in the sense of, you know, I need to make my text selection more diverse. That's basic entry level stuff. What I'm asking my teachers to do is think about what are the fundamental understandings about people that are being shared through these stories. What are the knowledges and wisdoms that are being offered through these stories, and how can I help, and how can I unite? Again, as our elders spoke to us, how are we bringing each other together with these understandings? And there's this beautiful thing that's happening between older literature and more contemporary literature that is being much more grounded in people and in place than ever before, and yet speaks to, but it's a universal story. It speaks to so many different people. And so, along with just generally being a geek about Indigenous young adult literature and being a nerd about these things, come talk to me and I will not shut up about this. I also think that it has very powerful, transformative elements that we can all learn from, we can all grow from.
Thank you so much. I will say, Dr. Muñoz, I have not yet read The Mural Thieves. I know it's abysmal. I have read a lot of other ones. It's on the list. It's going to happen. You will get a frantic email in caps, I'm sure, for me, like at 3 in the morning, probably Toronto time, so probably not too late, Vancouver. And I will be freaking out, I'm sure.
It's the only time where I have no qualms about answering. It's fine. Call me whenever. I'm happy to talk you through what is about to happen to you.
Okay. I'm clearly very excited. But my question is actually for Dr. Farrell. So we talked about this really briefly before the session started, but I had the chance to see you present about your work on storytelling, and personally I was really fascinated with the inspiration that you took from Indigenous cosmologies, like coming from a space, like I did my undergrad in political science and then worked in student development, but like this conversation about spirituality and like cosmology is kind of just like, you know, like mythology and folklore, and just like to see you bring it into the space of academy and like really make it tangible, but just like the way you talk about the concepts of like spirituality and souls was really, really interesting for me to hear. Can you please share a little bit more about this and how it inspires your writing?
So when I was on sabbatical winter 2023, that's when I started a draft of the Indigenous speculative fiction dystopian STEAM book. But I spent a lot of time before that thinking about, what that, my vision for that particular book and what I wanted to evoke and create within it. And part of it came through my own interest is part of spirituality is this idea of our 3 souls. So in kind of more traditional spirituality, we have a dream soul, a breath soul, and a body soul. And for me, the dream soul was the one that would allow you to to actually travel in your dreams, like dream walk. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that a bit. And so that was something that I was really interested in learning a little bit more about. I had been aware of it for a really long time. Just my mother would talk about it when I was a child. And for the novel, I wanted to evoke also then that sense of that balance of Indigenous and Western sciences, because I'm mixed. And for me, I carry both of that within me all the time. And some of the ideas of it, in Anishinaabe spirituality is that when we're thinking about the Aurora Borealis, that's actually souls in the sky of people who've passed on. And so for me, the novel, that became the setting, is, this cataclysmic kind of global event of solar flares and how the souls became, a part of that sky and, those fires in the sky at that point. But of course, we know from solar flares, there's a lot of kind of electromagnetic interferences. So it's just that's just a part of the setting. I don't know how deep I go into that particular description, but it's there. And so that's for me a way to evoke a sense of how can I embed various facets of my own spirituality, but also some teachings from my culture and knowledges that I gain and how I understand things from within sacred stories. So those are part of, this kind of creative narrative that I create.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the time here because I know we started a little bit later. Do I have time for one more? And
You do. If anyone has a cue card, I'll come around and collect it while Dr. Brett reads the last question.
okay, so so many things are coming up, but I'll stick to the script. I want to talk a little bit about YA genres because I'm fascinated with and again, I think this pulls away from the English studies tradition, right? Where I think that the theoretical frameworks that I, and I think three of us, apply to teaching Indigenous literatures are new and emerging within an academic context. But it goes to the power and agency of the stories themselves, right? So there's these really powerful theoretical frameworks that we don't impose on, but they actually emerge from the stories. So I wondered, I was gonna ask, what is your favorite Indigenous literary genre? But you might also want to respond to what I just said as a prompt.
Okay. So my favorite genre, I kind of mentioned it before, is horror. Not the blood and gore horror, but the eerie, unsettling, also ghosty kind of horror. The ones that kind of give you shivers up your back kind of horror. This, as an example, so I do a lot of beadwork, so this loom beading bracelet is inspired by the movie The Shining, which is the carpet in the hallway.
Love your reference.
Right, and in the movie there is actually quite a lot of imagery in there. There's a Morisot painting in one of the hallways in the offices part of the hotel, which is a whole other thing. But for YA genre, me embedding these, sometimes really subtly, I don't think you would have known that if I hadn't pointed it out, and sometimes more obviously. So maybe you want to. So I have a YA novel coming out that I wrote and is being published with Portage Press called The Moth Dreamer. So it's definitely spooky leaning. So I don't think it would be strictly horror, but it's certainly fantasy horror leaning type of YA. So there's a lot of embedded cultural teachings and backgrounds within that particular novel. And there's also, pretty kick-ass, Coco in there that kind of guides her granddaughter through the visions that she starts happening to her, and visions about people that she knows and her family and friends, as well as a Wendigo who kind of comes after her through her dreams. So there is a lot of kind of, I think, different types of spiritual elements in here. So I love horror, so I embed it in things that I write.
Kind of funny story. So one of our previous talks, we had Katharina Vermette and Aubrey Jean Hansen together in conversation. And then after we were just chatting, and I said that I actually shy away from horror. I've never watched The Shining. I've been in places where I have to leave the room if people are talking about horror. So Katharina Vermette sent us books after, and she said, I can't remember the name of the book offhand, but she's like, it's Indigenous horror, but she's like, don't worry, it's not too scary. So I'm gonna lean into it and kind of give it a try.
Yeah, maybe start with Harm's House or Bad Cree, or I'll stop. This is a hard question to answer because for me it's all of them, right? Like there's no genre that I shy away from when it comes to young adult literature, Indigenous young adult literature. When I think about it and when I teach about it, I use that emergent framework. There's no real English criticism that works for Indigenous literature at all. But what I try to bring to my students and to current practicing teachers who are thinking about how to incorporate Indigenous young adult literature into their classroom practices, I try to have them come away with a few different ideas about how to look at books. And a lot of this is really framed by our already sort of pre-existent biases and preconceptions about Indigenous people. So I look for things that challenge that, either directly or indirectly. And this is one of the great things about Indigenous young adult literature. Cherie Demoline talks about how she loves writing this genre because it's a genre that gets to lead with heart. You know, adult fiction can be very heady, and I don't do much with adult literature because I read enough journal articles, and that's enough grown-ups for one day. And so young adult literature leads with heart. So stories that tell about contemporary visions of indigeneity, things that are happening now, things that are happening in the future, anything that focuses on history within context as opposed to just history. Indigenous authors telling Indigenous stories rather than people writing about Indigenous people. The new and growing area of declared Indigenous feminist writers and queer writers who are bringing out stories and bringing out heroes that challenge all of our notions, both Western, colonial, but also Indigenous perspectives on diverse groups of people. Stories that explore Indigenous languages and also what Joshua Whitehead calls Indigenous Englishes, the ways that Indigenous people have picked up and utilized English in very creative ways. And then one of my favorites, because it just seems so regular, and I can't remember the scholar who talked about this, but they refer to it as the futurity of the mundane. These stories that just tell stories about Indigenous people doing stuff, right? It doesn't have to be spectacular or magical, because again, that conception of indigeneity and whatever, this wonderful story about these kids who go for a hike in the mountains. That's all. That's what they do. All kinds of hijinks ensue, of course, but just people doing stuff. So yeah, all of them.
So thank you so much for that. Gosh, I could keep. I look forward to continuing this conversation. But we're going to turn to the cue cards. Just going to take a look first. Okay. So this question is for both of you. Working in the education context, how do you employ Indigenous literatures as a tool for critical thinking and critical consciousness in the context of misinformation?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's a way to show examples when we're thinking more contemporary Indigenous literature. those real life examples and those portrayals of Indigenous peoples and young peoples, and how other Indigenous students can see themselves in those spaces and see them reflected within classrooms. There's a lot of, I'll say hesitancy from non-Indigenous, future teachers, pre-service teachers about moving into topics that are Indigenous, mostly for fear of offending people accidentally. And, it's finding where are those places that you might feel safe first? And I find people often feel safe in literature. And I think, literature itself has so much of a strong voice in terms of the messages that are carried across within those various types of texts. I think it's a way to kind of disrupt mistruths, and while also carrying avenues for critical thinking, but also in ways that are kind of not just comfortable, but as ways to kind of carry forward hopefully strong literature traditions within their own classroom spaces in the future.
I think the one thing I would add to that is very much that the stories that that are portrayed in Indigenous young adult literature are very often telling a story, and then are telling a story beneath the story, and then telling a story beneath this. There's so many levels to consider, and so the different areas that address these misunderstandings or misinformation, I think can be explored through a variety of texts and through a variety of authors who know what they're doing. Know what they're doing and are very good at it.
Thank you so much. This next question is also for you both. So what guides your selection of Indigenous children's literature that you use when teaching your teacher education students?
One of the things that, to Amy's point about literature also being a safe place for folks to engage with, is also that, and I can't speak 100% for certain for every author that has ever written about their community, but most authors are very good about making sure that what they publish is acceptable to be consumed by the public. Because I've often had educators ask me, is this a form of cultural appropriation, or am I sharing sacred knowledge that shouldn't be shared if I share this book? By and large, most authors are good about not sharing things that shouldn't be shared with the general public. And so once I get them over that bump, then it's a matter of helping them build these constructions in their heads around things like these contemporary visions, around who's telling the story, around what kind of story is being told, and very much like the sort of larger kind of societal picture, whose stories are we not hearing, whose stories have been erased, or whose stories are being ignored. And what are the reasons for that? So I ask my teachers, I challenge my teachers to really look for whose stories are we not hearing.
Yeah. Sorry, yes, and there's one more question. This is for Dr. Farrell. What's your favorite, of all the books your mother has written, what is your favorite and what makes it your favorite?
Okay, tricky question.
It is a tricky question. I think I definitely have a lot of emotional attachment to Honor of the Sun because that was her first book. So when she opened the box, I was like, why is it all the same book? And I was like, her name's on the book. It's like, oh, it's Mom's book. But I think I actually use, these are my words. So I, like Joaquin, I also teach a mandatory Indigenous education course in my faculty, and I make that book one of the books that students are expected to read. When she was approached by Scholastic, because she had written something else for them, and they had asked her to write, because it's in the Dear Diary series where everything's written in diary entry form. And she was very hesitant to approach the topic of writing about residential school because she is a residential school survivor. She went to Shingwalk Residential School. And I think it's, she had a lot of concerns about moving into that, and because it was going to be for youth, and didn't want to rosy-colored glasses soften so much of that history, but also it's for young people, and that finding that balance of it containing truths while also being appropriate for that age, right? So I think having those discussions with her and her seeking, I guess, my kind of thoughts about that, I think for me was a really great experience to have with my mother, but also as author, and some of the things that she was considering and thinking about. And there is a lot of truth in that book, and there is a lot of pieces in that book that came from her own experiences. Of course, it's still fiction, so there's a lot of things that didn't happen, but there were quite a few things that did happen that happened to her that she did incorporate into the text. And I think, as a text that can do teachings of that time period, for me, it's, when I think about truth and reconciliation, and that is really, for me, a great text to use within a classroom space.
Okay. This question, I don't know, maybe it does go back to this interdisciplinary piece, but just the idea of balancing academic writing versus creative writing, like what that, so different. Very different things. I find I can't do both at the same time. Yeah, so when I was on my research study leave working on the speculative fiction text, I tried at one point writing the beginnings of an article, and I had to stop because I was so much in the headspace of like dialogue and description, and then they're so different in format, so I had to just put the other one aside and just wait till I was done the book. Yeah, that's way too difficult. But do you feel like there's a weaving, like, do either of you feel like in some ways you weave the creative into?
Oh, for sure, yeah, I think, even like, I think of journal articles or book chapters as story, right? Just very different kinds of story, right? It's its own genre, right? And I try, especially like finding my voice, right? And trying to still stay true to my own articulated voice, in thinking about that type of writing a story, even though it's for a very different audience. And for me, like, how can I find that balance? Because I want to make sure that those, for me, journal articles or book chapters are still reading as something that anybody could take something from, right? Without it sounding overly like jargon.
I had a question for Dr. Muñoz. So, like, you clearly have a passion for Indigenous white literatures. Are you thinking of becoming an Indigenous white author yourself? Did I get something? Is there something in the works? And if so, you don't have to share, but like, what would be that genre, I think, for you that you'd hope to kind of kick off your lifelong journey as an author? Clearly throwing seeds here, hoping. Yeah, what would it be? What would you want to write?
I promise nothing. I promise nothing. I think, were I to do that, I think I would continue with sort of like Indigenous Stranger Things. It's like Stranger Things and Reservation Dogs have a baby. And what I think is what's really interesting to me about where a story like that would go is the ability to portray these diverse experiences of Indigenous people in so many different ways. Somebody brilliantly talked about the way that Indigenous people, in how we Indigenous. And so I'm excited about all of the different ways and all of the different expressions of indigeneity. And so if I were, again, I can't make any promises, if I were to bring an entry into this genre, it would really look at how are all of these different people expressing themselves in different ways and still maintaining their connection to who they are as a First Nations Indigenous person, while also, do whatever it is that they happen to do in the way that they do it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I like pictures, so I don't know.
Yeah.
It's very exciting. So that was it for the questions that we have and the questions on the cue cards. But I'm wondering if there's anything that you wanted to share that we didn't ask, or any sort of final thoughts.
It used to be that for scholars of Indigenous young adult literature that you could read every book that was written in this genre in the year, right? Like there was so little being published. What was there was mighty and was incredible, but there was 5 or 6, and now like I study this almost full time, and I still hear people telling me about books that I didn't know existed. So there's this wonderful just plethora of books that are being offered everywhere. Cynthia Leitig-Smith, Don Quigley, Jen Ferguson, Byron Graves, Brian Eric Gansworth, so many people who are writing such incredible literature for us to have access to. So it makes my job much harder, but it also makes it that much more exciting. So go to your bookstore. Go get some Indigenous authored text, and as soon as Amy's is coming out, get hers too.
And buy another bookshelf.
Yeah, I don't think I really have anything other to add, other than read more. And audiobooks are reading.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to welcome you all. Thank the speakers. Thank you so much for this really enriching conversation. Unfortunately, we have to close, but I look forward to all of the other interactions and other gatherings that I'm sure we will see you all at. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists today. We do have some tokens of appreciation. Thank you so much for coming all the way out. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sorry. Really quick plug. Once again, we do have wonderful vendors in the back. So if you haven't had a chance to check out their work, please do. They create such wonderful pieces, and we hope you will see them. Thank you so much.